right. Thank you so much, Robert, for accepting this interview to be with us at the Philosophy and Academy of the IPM.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for your time. Bob Pasnau doesn't need more of an introduction. He's known to us who work on medieval philosophy, who work on history of philosophy, and to those of us who work on philosophy as well. He has contributed to many different areas of the field and particularly devoted himself to history of philosophy. He's the editor of the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy and the founding editor of Oxford Studies on medieval philosophy. And we're going to talk about some of his books today, and his most recent one is After Certainty and the History of Our Epistemic Ideals and Illusions. So Bob, I'd like to start with the general question about the value of history of philosophy, what it is all about, why is it interesting, what is valuable about pursuing this?
Yeah.
You have a paper, a talk, an address you gave called Philosophical Beauty, in which you argue that alongside truth, beauty is also an important value of philosophy, and the things you had in mind are the power of arguments, the clarity of prose, the originality of ideas. So I have a question to you on a more personal front. How does that answer you have on the more theoretical level connect to your project? What drives you to study new themes and new periods in the history of philosophy?
Yeah. Well, it's a question I think about a lot. I'm in a typical American context where I'm in a department with a bunch of folk who don't work in the history of philosophy, aren't much interested in the history of philosophy, and I don't have a lot of historians around me in Boulder, and so for me the question is kind of always arising: why do I sort of do the things in philosophy that I do, and what value does it have? And at a certain point, that paper you mentioned grew out of this sort of frustration of always needing to find some kind of edifying higher value to the pursuit of the history of philosophy. And at some point, I just sort of thought, look, a big part of the reason why I do what I do is I just find I find that stuff fascinating. I find it completely rewarding just to think about it and to teach it and to write about it. And I thought, what exactly is so rewarding about it? And I decided that it's not so different from the situation in the arts, where there's just a kind of beauty to it, and that will it advance the field of philosophy in the 21st century? I don't know. Will it, lead to the discovery of some deep new truths? I don't know. But it's the stuff we work on in the history of philosophy and medieval philosophy in particular. It's just wonderful philosophy, and it's worth doing just because studying wonderful, brilliant philosophy is totally worth doing. So I guess to your specific question, what gets me excited about projects, what leads me to take up a new project, what sort of guides the sorts of stuff I work on. It's really mainly a matter of my running into things that I don't understand and wanting to understand them. I'm not somebody who likes kind of returning over and over again to the same topics. There are some philosophers, and I don't just mean historians of philosophy, but in general, in philosophy, there are some philosophers who a fairly small focus on which they spend their whole career. And I admire that. I mean, it's a style of doing philosophy, and it can produce some really, really good, careful work that's really sort of progressing in a fine-grained way to some better understanding of some particular issue. That's not at all the way I work. I'll write something on a topic. Sometimes it'll be a whole book, sometimes just an article, and it'll be something that I just don't understand, and that's what gets me excited about it. And I sort of work on it and work on it and work on it until I feel like I understand it well enough to write something up. And then I'm just that point ready to move on. Like, what's my next topic going to be? And so I suppose that's why the work I do covers a lot of ground, because that's what excites me about stuff. I get excited about working on things when I just do not understand what's going on.
My next question is related to this. You have worked on a number of different topics and produced excellent books from the topics you did research on. Your very first book was on history of epistemology, and I think that seems like a thread that continued throughout your career. The first book I have in mind is Theories of Cognition in the Later Middle Ages, published by Cambridge University Press in 1997. And that interest, in a sense, went full circle in After Certainty that I've just mentioned in the beginning. In the middle, it's also important to mention Metaphysical Themes in that trajectory, published by Oxford University Press. The latter is an invaluable contribution to the history of metaphysics. I think one common aspect of the most recent books, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, is that they pay more attention to the continuities and the ruptures between medieval and early modern philosophy. I think both in the After Certainty, that is on the background, the story, and in the Metaphysical Themes, although in a very different way, the relation between medieval times and modernity is also on the background of that book. While working on these books, did you develop any views about the medieval and modernity divide in philosophy? What is your current views on these matters?
Yeah, well, so I went to graduate school. I went to Cornell University to get my PhD with the express purpose of studying medieval philosophy with Norman Kretzmann. And that's what I did. And I had a lot of interest in philosophy. You know, I was back then, as I continue to be, interested in a lot of non-historical topics, but I mainly wanted to study medieval philosophy. And of course, that's what I did. And so my first book, Theories of Cognition in the Later Middle Ages, was my dissertation. Well, it grew out of my dissertation. And that's a strictly medieval book. And I sort of thought, well, this is just what I'm going to do for my career. My second book on Thomas Aquinas, of course, also strictly a medieval book. But I started to, I got more and more interested in later medieval material. I started to think about Aquinas not as sort of the end of the road for the Middle Ages, as, you know, that's sort of a traditional conception of Aquinas, the culminating point of medieval philosophy, after which, you know, it all goes into decline. That's sort of this notorious, you know, earlier sort of conception of the field that I think we've now left behind. And I started to sort of take that seriously myself and get interested in the later material. And I sort of had a very hard time seeing a stopping point in the later Middle Ages, you know, at which it stops being interesting. And, you know, if you go all the way ahead to Suarez in the 16th century, boy, that's pretty interesting stuff. And it's very much recognizably in the scholastic tradition, going back to Aquinas, you know, and other 13th century figures and Aristotelianism and all of that. It's obvious, you know, to anybody who looks at that stuff, that there's quite a lot of continuity from Suarez stretching back into the high Middle Ages. And so then if you're thinking of all of that as this sort of block of extremely interesting material, it's natural to then ask the question, well, what happened? Why did that tradition start to wind down? I mean, it didn't, of course, stop overnight. Scholasticism is alive and well in the 17th century and beyond, but obviously this new important dominant thing comes onto the scene in the 17th century. It's, you know, so dominant, so transformative that people just call it modern philosophy. I started to, you know, take seriously sort of the question, what happened? Why did scholasticism die? Why did this so-called modern philosophy rise up? How different are they really? I never doubted that they were different, and I still don't doubt that they are extremely different in important ways. But exactly which ways are they different? Do they have commonalities that are perhaps not so obvious? Um, and so I started to really sort of worry about those questions. Um, and at the same time, at a more personal level, I was frustrated at the way medieval philosophy can feel like this very sort of self-contained, separate field. Um, people work in ancient, people work in modern. Oh, and then there's a few people doing medieval. And I just thought, this is absurd. There ought to be room for research projects that cross over from one field to the other. And so in metaphysical themes and in after certainty, the project was very much to try to tell a story about those parts of the history of philosophy that just ignored those kind of sub-disciplinary boundaries and just tried to tell a continuous story that ignored the fact that the first half is medieval and the second early modern. Um, I find it extraordinarily difficult to do. I think anybody who tries it finds it extraordinarily difficult to do. But I think it's super important to try to do those things because we sort of neatly compartmentalize these fields, but in the historical context, nobody was doing that. One thing led to another, led to another, led to another, and if you put them in these compartments, you're gonna get the history wrong in all kinds of ways.
Hmm. And your current book project is on voluntarism, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Um, so that is a very interesting topic and a classic, in one way, medieval topic. But I guess I can already see by your answers and by your scholarship that the topic can be approached in many various different ways and in different facets. So I would like to ask a question about what is voluntarism and what is this movement? When did it took place?
So one thing to say right from the start is that despite what I just said in my previous answer, this new book project is not a project that attempts to cross over from medieval into the 17th century. This book goes back to sort of my earlier roots and is a solely medieval project.
No.
And I sort of it's imaginable that I might have been tempted to sort of push on in the 17th century. I have a hard time resisting the temptation to do that. But in this case, I just never felt the temptation because the medieval material is so wonderfully sophisticated that it just cries out for attention all by itself. Whereas, sort of, the better I understood the debates, and as I looked from time to time at 17th century material, Hobbes, Locke, Leibniz, Descartes, um, I just thought these folk in the 17th century are not doing anything new. They know a little bit about these scholastic debates. They're responding in intelligent ways to those debates.
Mm.
They're very, they're brilliant men, and these names, these famous names from the 17th century. But I just can't see that they're doing anything fundamentally new. Now that's a a crazily wide sweeping generalization, and I'm ready to be corrected on this point or that point. But I think it's just manifestly clear that by and large, when it comes to the debate over free will, it's really the later Middle Ages, the 13th and 14th century, where the action is, where you get this series of really important innovations that just transform our understanding of those issues. And since that time, really everything else is just a series of footnotes to what went on back in those centuries. So you asked, what is voluntarism? Well, when I began this project, I thought that I was going to write a book that took the very many senses of voluntarism that people used and offered a kind of unifying account of what it is to be a voluntarist in the context of the will, what it is to be a voluntarist in the context of God's ability to frame the moral law, sometimes called theological voluntarism. Um, there's voluntarism in various other theological contexts having to do with grace and foreknowledge and providence. There's voluntarism in a more political context. The term gets used extraordinarily widely, and it's very, very confusing. Like I said at the start of the interview, what often motivates me is just my own sense of perplexity. And I felt very perplexed about this. And I thought, there's nobody that's really written a book that sorts through all of this and explains it. And I thought I was going to do that. It's now looking like I'm not going to do that at all, because I started with voluntarism in the context of the will, and I'm more than halfway done with the book now, and I haven't gotten past that, and I don't think I'm going to get past that, because that all by itself has turned out to be kind of sufficient for a good-sized book, it's just looking more and more like it wouldn't be helpful to sort of pull in these other senses of voluntarism. So my focus is strictly on what is it to be a voluntarist in the context of the narrow debate over free will. And I've come to think, even in that narrow, let me back up, even in that narrow context, people worry about this terminology of voluntarist a lot, and they contrast voluntarism with intellectualism, and pretty much everybody complains about this terminology and complains about how poorly defined it is, even in this narrow context. I've come to think that, in fact, I'm prepared to offer a kind of a strict definition of what voluntarism is. And in fact, what I want to do is I want to distinguish between two stages of the voluntarist movement. And I want to claim they're both fairly well defined, and they're both extraordinarily important for the history of philosophy. The first stage, I call this first stage semi-voluntarism. And these labels, these aren't medieval labels, right? These are 19th century labels that we impose back upon these debates. So you can use these labels however you want. The labels don't matter so much, but I'm calling this first stage semi-voluntarism. And for me, semi-voluntarism arises when you get the doctrine of the will as a faculty, and then critically importantly, the will as a faculty becomes that within us which is in control of our agency. It becomes the thing in control, the thing in charge. I call this the doctrine of agential will, that the will becomes an agent within us, the controlling agent within us. That's such a familiar idea that I think it's essentially gone unnoticed by historians of philosophy. And people just take it for granted that, oh, well, right, that's what a will is. That was not what a will was until the 13th century. It was only in the 13th century that this conception of the will as a faculty of the soul and as the faculty of the soul within us that's in control, it's only in the 13th century that that emerges. It emerges in people like Robert Grosseteste, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, and I think particularly I give Grosseteste a lot of credit for, in my mind, being the first person to really clearly formulate this kind of view. But of course, Aquinas and Bonaventure are the massively influential figures who I think completely embrace this picture. And with them, it just becomes such a dominant conception of what the will is, nobody even thinks to question it. And it's almost an invisible doctrine because it becomes so taken for granted. Nobody argues against it. But I think in a lot of ways, you can make the case that it's the most important idea in all of medieval philosophy. Now, that's a pretty crazy thing to say. But the reason I put it so strongly is I think, what other idea in medieval philosophy has so transformed our conception of the self than this idea that we have within us a will controls our agency with which we sort of go about our daily life and make our way through the world. So I think when that idea happens, that's what I call the first stage of voluntarism. Now, that's not what people ordinarily mean by voluntarism. But I think the reason why people will read Aquinas and Bonaventure and they'll see a kind of voluntarism there is because the will is extraordinarily important to both of those figures. And I think I've just tried to describe the way in which it's important, this conception of an agential will. Now, the second stage of voluntarism, as I understand it, arises around 1277 with the condemnation. Now, the condemnation is putting in writing a kind of groundswell of opinion. And what this opinion involves, what happens in 1277 is the idea that this agential will within us should be conceived of as a first cause, undetermined by any sort of past causally necessitating history. To understand this transformative moment, it's critical to see how Aristotelianism, as it was brought into the university in the 13th century, came through this Arabic filter. And the Arabic filter was heavily, heavily deterministic. I'm talking about Ibn Sina, and I'm talking about Ibn Rushd, but also even somebody like Al-Ghazali, as Al-Ghazali's ideas were transmitted through his work, The Aims of Philosophy, and people thought of that as Al-Ghazali's own work. All of these Arabic sources presented a version of Aristotelianism that was deterministic. And I think the first generations of Latin philosophers in the university, philosophers and theologians, just felt as if, okay, this is the best philosophy we have available to us, a deterministic philosophy. And I think these first generations, and I include both Aquinas and Bonaventure in this camp, I think all of these folk thought, we need to tell a story about the will that's going to be compatible with that background Aristotelian story about causal determinism. But what happens in 1277, as I understand the story, is that this kind of groundswell of opinion against that view arose, and people said, if our choice is between making the will determined and following this Aristotelian, this Arabic Aristotelianism, we should reject the Aristotelianism. It's not worth, holding on to Aristotelianism if that forces us to say that the will is determined by its causal antecedents. So they reject that part of Aristotelianism. They insist on the will as a first cause. And that's what you get in Henry of Ghent, Peter John O'Leary, and then after those two, it snowballs, and it becomes just the common opinion. And you get still more sort of radical proponents of voluntarism like John Duns Scotus and William Ockham, and it's everywhere at this point. And the condemnations of 1277 are very important because although those condemnations are notoriously kind of all over the place and scattered in what they condemn, over and over again, those condemnations come back to the problem of free will. And one thing that they are clear about is condemning this doctrine, the will is determined by its causal antecedents. And that was widely understood to be something that after the 1277 condemnations, you just couldn't say it anymore. And so that for me is where you get sort of full-blown real voluntarism after 1277. Levy and Henry of Ghent and Scotus and Ockham and a whole lot of other figures too. That's the rise for me of the fully voluntarist movement.
Thank you for this glimpse over the story of the book. I'm very looking forward to seeing it and reading it. I wanted to go back for my next question to something that you mentioned that that the conception of the will as a controlling faculty, as a central faculty in agency, is one of the, if not the medieval contribution, one of the most important, if not the medieval, most important medieval contributions to philosophy, or to at least to the history of ideas, because that seems an important point, right? Is during this project, you have explored voluntarism from different angles, from what I could see in the talks and the papers during this time. For example, from analysis of modalities, which are issues that you talked about in the context of determinism and so on, to even conceptions of the self in English literature. And I'd like to link that to the interview. And I get the impression that that alongside this narrow, specifically defined notion of voluntarism, in which the medieval contribution can be understood, these ideas seem to have an important impact in our understanding of the self, right? In the, as you yourself mentioned. Do you have an idea of the ways that voluntarism impacted our culture, both in philosophy and perhaps outside of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the story I was just telling you is really the story of the first half of the book. And that part of the book's written. Um, that was the part of the book on which I based a series of lectures I gave in Paris this past spring. And those are actually going to be published in French before they appear in English with Vrin,
Yeah.
hopefully as soon as next year. And so that tells the more kind of theoretical story of how I see the debate going, the more kind of what you'd expect from a history of philosophy. But but for me, a lot of the interest in the project is to think about just the kind of thing you were asking about, to think about, well, what difference does this make to the self to think of the will in this way, to think about ourselves as being controlled by this will within us. And so the second half of the book, which I'm working on now, tries to develop those sorts of questions by way of asking sort of the master question of the narrative is, what's the value of this sort of approach to human nature, to think of ourselves as having a will in this way? Is this somehow, does this give us somehow better control over our lives? Does this give us a picture of human nature that somehow is more appealing? You find a lot of rhetoric among the voluntarists to the effect that there's nothing more important within us than the will. Um, the will is this thing that marks us off from the rest of nature and makes us puts us on a level that we're almost in a sense comparable to the angels and even to God, because we're united with them in this shared faculty that's undetermined by the rest of nature. And so the question I ask in the second part of the book is, what's in what way exactly is that valuable? And that's in effect to ask a question about how does this change our conception of ourselves. And I'm very interested, for instance, in looking at medieval literature, especially medieval English literature, and thinking about how these concepts appear there. Now, you do find, in Chaucer, for instance, you do find explicit mentions of philosophy, of these debates. Chaucer translated all of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. He was very interested in philosophy. But what I'm most interested in is not sort of the explicit discussions of philosophy, but I'm interested in the way in which this voluntaristic picture changes the way they think about human beings being in the world. And I think what you see over and over again in medieval literature is you see that the principal concern, their principal way of kind of engaging with human beings and their place in the world is this picture of human beings on this kind of moral quest where we have to somehow find a way through our lives in a way that will allow us to secure the kind of moral aims that we have, to act morally, to act in the way God wants us to act, to follow God's laws, to pursue our happiness in the right sort of way amidst all of the challenges of life. And so if you read something like Gawain and the Green Knight, this is the story of a man, Gawain, who voluntarily chooses to go on this quest to satisfy this promise that he sort of forced to make at the start of the story. And the whole journey is this precarious attempt on his part to make it through the narrative to his destination in such a way that he preserves his moral goodness. And I think it's this picture on which human beings are put in this extraordinarily precarious situation where there's temptation surrounding them on all sides, where they don't know what the right thing to do is, and they're left to the goodness of their will to do the right thing if they can. If they can't, of course, well, the penalty, of wrongdoing in the Middle Ages is eternal damnation. And so the stakes couldn't be any higher. And I think the element of medieval literature that I'm most interested in and I find just fascinating is the way that these high stakes and the difficulty for human beings of trying to kind of win this game so difficult, so kind of desperate, and you see this dramatized over and over again in all of these great works of English literature.
Thank you. I guess for my last question, and again, that was very interesting. It leaves me wanting to read more about what will come out of the book. And the last question, also picking up on something you said a few moments ago, is that perhaps this impact of voluntarism has been so widespread and high that we take many things for granted about the picture of ourselves, about the picture of human beings in the world that come from this movement, but were perhaps not previously there, and where these ideas have a certain history and so on. Are there any, when you were working through this material, would you like to highlight something you found surprising or unexpected about how this movement or how the conception of a free will were developed in the first place?
Yeah, I think in a way, most surprising conclusion I've reached, something I alluded to already, but it bears repeating and stressing, is that as I understand the story, there was a kind of a general consensus in the 13th century, up until 1277, that a theory of the will was going to have to be compatible with this Arabic style Aristotelianism and its determinism. That there's a general consensus there. And I just cannot find anybody before 1277 saying in any text that survived that they think these deterministic principles should be rejected. Everybody knows about these deterministic principles. You can say exactly what they are. You can find them in the Arabic text, in the Latin text. You can find authors quoting them and citing them over and over again. I can't find anybody rejecting them. I can't find anybody putting forward a theory of will that isn't compatible with this deterministic teaching. And then, on my story, 1277 happens, and things completely switch. And within not very long after 1277, everybody has swung to the other side, and everybody agrees that we should reject the determinism of that reading of Aristotle, that we should embrace the will as an indeterminate first cause, a prime mover. That just becomes the universally accepted view. Even somebody like John Buridan, who I think you can see is not really thrilled by this way of going, Buridan just feels obligated to embrace it as I read him. And I think I don't think he's just saying that because of church authority. I think he really thinks that, yeah, if we're really going to save human freedom and we're really going to make human beings morally responsible for their actions, I think Buridan thinks we really do have to find some sort of kernel of indeterminacy within the will. And so that sort of voluntaristic view goes from being something that nobody believed in the first 3/4 of the 13th century to something that everybody believed. And that consensus then endures, as I understand the debate, it endures within scholasticism for centuries. And it sort of hardens into church teaching, and later Thomists embrace the view and they think they can find it back in Aquinas himself, which I think is a mistake. But at any rate, everybody holds the view. And that doesn't change until the Reformation. And then you get people like Luther and Calvin, who don't believe in free will at all. And then you get philosophers like Hobbes and Locke living in Protestant countries in which they have more leeway to reject that sort of voluntaristic approach. But there's this chunk of time in the late Scholastic era in which voluntarism just becomes the view that everybody takes. And I think that's a surprising conclusion, but I think it's particularly surprising that it changes so quickly, right around 1277.
Right. So let me thank you then, Bob, for this wonderful interview you gave to us, for your time. And we're very looking forward to see the wonderful project flourish into the book.
Thanks. It's my pleasure. I enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.